elections is merely exacerbating the tendency to demagoguery, where each person seeking office plays shamelessly to the mob, promising all manner of things that they know they will not and cannot deliver. Think of almost anybody you like. And furthermore, while the regime, the American regime in many ways, is in principle open to all and prides itself on a belief in equality, no doubt Aristotle would remark that its offices are in fact open only to the rich and to leaders who can acquire the support of the rich, making it rather an oligarchy in the guise of a republic. So Aristotle was not without his own critique of the American Constitution and American political culture. There is obviously much in the American regime that Aristotle would have found admirable, even though it does not conform to his idea of the best regime, which is the subject of the last two books of the Politics, books 7 and 8. Aristotle is very sketchy here about the structure, the institutional structure, the makeup of the best regime, acknowledging it is the best regime is one where the best men rule. That is to say, it is a kind of aristocracy or an aristocratic republic. And I want to talk about this regime a little bit now. What Aristotle understands to be the requirements or the fulfillments, the necessities of this aristocratic republic. In these parts of the Politics, Aristotle offers a serious challenge to existing Greek traditions and patterns of political education. Every bit, in many ways, as far-reaching as Plato's Republic. In the first place, he tells us the purpose of the best regime, the purpose of Aristotle's Republic, is directed not to war, but in fact to peace. The citizen of the best regime, he says, must be able to sustain war if duty requires, but only for the sake of peace and leisure. Again, a critique not only of Sparta, but also of Athens and its imperialistic ambitions. And second, Aristotle understands the purpose of leisure when he says the end of the regime is peace and the purpose of peace is leisure. He doesn't understand by leisure simply relaxation, enjoying your private moments, enjoying your vacation time. Leisure does not simply mean rest or inactivity, but leisure is necessary for education, or what he sometimes calls by the term philosophy. And by philosophy, he seems to suggest not so much the capacity for abstract or speculative thought, but rather a kind of liberal education that he regards to be the preserve of what he calls by the term the megalopsychos, literally the great-souled person, or the great-souled man. Megalo being, our term for great, and psychos, related our word psyche, soul, psyche, the great-souled person, the great-souled man. The gentleman is in many ways, for Aristotle, the ideal recipient of this form of education, of liberal education, and also, in some respects, the ideal or perfect audience or readership of the book itself. And we can see here, or we can begin to see, it is clear how Aristotle's best regime differs from Plato's intransigent demand for the rule of philosopher kings. The megalopsychos, the gentleman, whatever else he is not a philosopher in the strict sense. Sociologically, Aristotle makes clear that the megalopsychos, unlike the philosopher, is a person of some inherited wealth, chiefly landed property, but whose way of life will be urban. He will be a member of what we might call the urban patriciate. And in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle provides us with a vivid list of the psychological and even physical characteristics that such a person must possess, this megalopsychos. Such a person, he says, exhibits a sort of lofty detachment to the more or less petty things that weigh most of us down. Aristotle tells us he is slow to act unless something of great importance is at stake. He repays favor with interest so as not to be under any obligations to others. The gentleman, he says, speaks his mind without fear or favor, somewhat like the New York Times, because to dissemble would be beneath him. He may occasionally hurt others, but this is not done out of deliberate cruelty. And in addition, Aristotle tells us such a person will possess beautiful but useless things, suggesting the possession not only of wealth, but of a kind of cultivated aesthetic sense. As if that weren't enough, Aristotle tells us that the megalopsychos walks slowly, because to hurry is undignified, is tall, and speaks with a deep voice. Very clear about who, again, the ideal statesman or reader, potential statesman of reader of this book would be. But most importantly, you might say, what distinguishes the gentleman as a class from the philosophers is a certain kind of knowledge or practical intelligence. The gentleman may lack the speculative intelligence of a Socrates, but he will possess that quality of practical rationality, of practical judgment necessary for the administration of affairs. Aristotle calls this kind of knowledge, this kind of practical judgment, he calls it by the term phronesis that I have on the blackboard. And the person who possesses it is the phronimos, a person of practical judgment. Again, a term that captures something of our meaning of common sense, practical wisdom, the capacity for judging, the capacity for judgment, which is not the same thing, obviously, as speculative or philosophic intelligence. The phronimos is the person who is able to grasp the fitting or the appropriate thing to do out of the complex arrangements that make up any situation. And above all, such a person embodies that special quality of insight and discrimination that distinguishes him or her from people, again, of more theoretical or speculative cast of mind. How is this quality of phronesis, of judgment, of practical wisdom, of horse sense, how is it acquired? Aristotle tells us that this kind of knowledge is appropriate, is the kind of knowledge most appropriate to politics. Again, it is neither, and he wants to be clear about this, it is neither the theoretic knowledge aimed simply at abstract truths, nor is it the productive knowledge, what he calls techne, the productive knowledge used in the manufacture of useful artifacts. What is it then? It is a knowledge of how to act where the purpose of action is acting well. You might say it is less a body of true propositions than a shrewd sense of know-how or political savvy. This kind of knowledge entails judgment and deliberation, the deliberative skill or the deliberative art. We only deliberate, Aristotle says, over things where there is some choice, We deliberate with an eye to preservation or change, to making something better, or to preserve it from becoming worse. This kind of knowledge will be the art or craft of the statesman, concerned above all with what to do in a specific situation. It is the skill possessed by the greatest statesmen, you might say the fathers of the constitutions, as it were, who create the permanent framework in which allows later and lesser figures to handle change. This is the kind of political skill and wisdom, again, possessed of the founders of cities, the legislative founders of regimes. And Aristotle's Politics is a book about the kind of knowledge requisite for that kind of skill. This quality of practical judgment, phronesis, practical wisdom, was developed, I think, in a beautiful essay, without any explicit reference to Aristotle, by the English political philosopher Isaiah Berlin. Anyone here ever heard of Isaiah Berlin? Not one of you? Famous English philosopher, died a number of years ago in the late 90s. Okay, but this I hope will be an inspiration to, you should read Isaiah Berlin. In any case, he wrote a wonderful essay called Political Judgment. And in it he asks, what is the intellectual quality that successful statesmen possess that distinguishes them from all other, that distinguishes their knowledge from all other forms of rationality and knowledge? And he writes as follows.